Welcome to Sunlighten Spotlight. I am Connie Zack, co-owner of Sunlighten, and thrilled today to bring to you Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, who is a Washington University fellowship trained physician specializing in nutritional science and geriatrics. She is also the founder of the Institute of Muscle Centric Medicine and really wants to focus on changing the paradigm in medicine from obesity centric to muscle centric. And I can't wait to hear how we're going to do that. Welcome, Dr. Lyon.
Hi, Connie. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I'm so happy that you're here. And I'm fascinated, as I was telling you a little off the camera, with your topic and your knowledge and how we can take your knowledge and practically, apply it. So first, before we get into, all of your wisdom, can you share with our Sunlighten guests and listeners, like what got you started in this focus?
Yeah. Well, I have been fortunate enough to be trained by some of the world leading experts. And, it's interesting when we think about the concept of muscle centric medicine, which is really my primary focus. It's about understanding that muscle is the organ of longevity. And when I am speaking about muscle, I'm really talking about skeletal muscle. And Connie, you look like you work out. So it's the
Oh,
muscle.
that means so much coming from you.
It's the muscle that we have voluntary control over. And what we have really missed the mark on in terms of the health and wellness space and just overall medicine is that we're so focused on obesity and we're so focused on this obesity model and trying to fix obesity when really the issue is skeletal muscle. And muscle is the pinnacle, not really the periphery of health. And muscle is actually an endocrine organ system. And what does that mean?
Right.
That means that muscle is very similar to an organ system like the thyroid. And what's so fascinating about muscle is that when you actually exercise and you contract this tissue, you have direct control over an organ system, that you actually can contract this system, this skeletal muscle, you secrete myokines. And the listener's probably like, well, what's a
What's that?
myokine?
Right.
And a myokine is a protein that is released from skeletal muscle. And why this is so important is because the impact that it plays on the body as it relates to full body homeostasis, which simply means the body's balance. Contracting skeletal muscle, exercising skeletal muscle interacts with the immune system. The more obvious is that it really relates to nutrient utilization and distribution. So, for example, carbohydrates, glucose disposal. We've all heard of diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's. These are diseases that actually originate in skeletal muscle first. From my perspective, it's skeletal muscle insulin resistance, which simply means we've all heard about insulin. Insulin is a hormone released from the pancreas, and it's a hormone necessary to move sugar or glucose out of the bloodstream into cells. And we always think about obesity being the problem, but really these issues begin in skeletal muscle first. So if we can address skeletal muscle as the focal point, we can change the trajectory of the way in which we age.
It's just phenomenal. So interesting. It's fascinating. I can't wait. I want to get to the skeletal muscle questions, but want to take one more step back for a second
Of course.
because I'm fascinated with your background and what led you. Like, was there something growing up or something in school that caused you to get into nutritional science, like to study this? Because you studied, you know, for a long time and
Yeah.
or getting into like what led you to this?
That's a great question. I am fortunate. Again, I think that there's this thing that, and this is going to sound a little esoteric, but we all have a mission on this planet. And I think that there are certain things that ultimately align to allow one to perpetuate their own personal mission. And my godmother's name is Liz Lipsky. And Liz is one of the OGs in the functional medicine space. So before the era of Mark Hyman, it was Liz and Liz's colleagues She's a PhD in nutritional sciences, and I moved in with her when I was 17. Graduated high school early, and I moved in with a PhD in nutritional sciences from a really young age. So at 17, I knew that I wanted to study nutritional sciences. It was very clear to me that this is what I wanted to do, and I was very interested in fitness and, the physique and the body. And then I landed at University of Illinois, which wasn't far from you in Indiana, University of Illinois, and I happened to land into the classroom of someone named Dr. Donald Lehman. And anyone who is listening who knows me knows Don Lehman is not only my longtime mentor, but also a best friend, really my best friend. And he is one of the world leading protein experts to this day. And he's mentored me over the past 2 decades. So, started in nutritional sciences, landed in the home of a PhD in more functional, integrative nutrition, then did my undergraduate with a world leading protein expert who then went on to mentor me for 2 decades. Of course, medical school, then residency, and then following residency, I went back to a fellowship. So I did what's called a postdoc in nutritional sciences and geriatrics. What made this so interesting is that most people do residency, and then depending on their desires, do a fellowship. A fellowship is typically, the majority of fellowships are clinical in nature, but I actually did a fellowship that was combined clinical in geriatrics with it, which is really aging, and then also clinical research in nutritional sciences.
Wow. So you were able to see the connection.
Right. And that's actually where the concept of muscle-centric medicine was born, is that, so I ran an obesity clinic for 2 years. And I realized that, and, I became very attached to one of the participants in one of the studies, and I felt she was a mom of 3. She was postmenopausal, and I imaged her brain, right? So part of my work was to look at body composition and then brain health. And I imaged her brain, and her brain looked very similar to an Alzheimer's brain. And I really feel that we failed, and that we failed her family, and we were failing as a community, as a medical community, because we were so focused on obesity. And if obesity was the right thing to focus on, we would have treated it, right? We would have treated it over the last 30 years. So the efficacy of treating a problem, from my perspective, is really being able to ask the right question. And we've been asking the wrong question. And I realized that these years of yo-yo dieting, while yes, she was overweight, she had no muscle mass. And muscle, as I'd mentioned earlier, is really the pinnacle for things like glucose disposal, insulin resistance, fatty acid metabolism, strength, longevity. She didn't have any. And that's in an effort to really bridge the gap. This is where muscle-centric medicine was born. I remember the exact moment.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that story. That was so interesting. And I could see one of my questions was, also was understanding why the Institute, and I can, now I can feel it from you, why, and it's so important. So let's get to some of the tips and some of the ways that listeners can apply your knowledge, to their bodies. I don't even know where to start first. So maybe you can help us with, help us with that kind of what to do.
So let's talk about skeletal muscle as really the pinnacle of health and well-being. Okay. And when we think about skeletal muscle, there's 2 major action steps that we can personally take. And that is 1, obviously exercise, which, okay, but we're going to talk about that. And then 2, nutritional strategies to optimize skeletal muscle. Okay. These are 2 very important fundamental things. Let's start with movement. Exercise, the typical recommendation is 150 minutes over a week. Okay, well, that's great, but that's probably what you should be doing anyway. Okay, cardiovascular activity, zone 2 training, keeping mitochondria healthy, doing stuff for cardiovascular effects, great. Again, I mentioned that skeletal muscle is an organ system, so contracting skeletal muscle, and a lot of the research has been done on aerobic type activity, increases these myokines that go throughout the body and interface with the immune system, interface with every tissue in the body, the brain, helps with mood, all of it. But from a very practical standpoint, I think that we need to not think about that 150-minute recommendation as exercise. I think that that's what you have to do, just like brushing your teeth.
Okay.
And here's the reason. We are largely domesticated as humans. A long time ago, we didn't have the option to do nothing or to order DoorDash or sit on the sofa. Physical movement is how we were designed. And not just any physical movement, we were also designed to lift heavy things and put them down. From a practical recommendation, you are looking at, there's a couple ways to think about it, but from a listener perspective who's just getting started, resistance training, three days a week, 3 to 4 days a week, full body training, and I say target for hypertrophy, which hypertrophy is muscle growth, versus targeting strength. Strength is obviously increasing your ability to lift heavier things. And I'm going to tell you why.
Okay, so can you back up for a second? Because I want to make sure I'm thinking of myself as far as understanding, because I really love this topic, and especially when you connect it to aging, longevity, et cetera. So,
which is actually the way of the future.
Right.
It's the way of the future.
Yeah. I get it. I think it's awesome. What was I going to ask? So as far as resistance training, so can you speak to, what does that mean for everybody?
Let's think about now, again, I think about exercise recommendations much more difficult to make than nutrition recommendations. And the reason they are much more difficult to make is that it's so subjective. Mm-hmm. I could go train and I could say, hey, I'm doing 10 sets per muscle per week to just maintain my muscle mass. And I'm doing 12 to 15 reps of 10 sets. But the muscle doesn't know at that 15th rep, okay, you're stimulated, right? Whereas if I'm eating a steak, I know, okay, I just ate 4 ounces of steak. So there's a huge variability in output from individuals. There's a mind-muscle connection. There's ability to focus and execute. We all know those individuals who go to the gym and they're still doing the exact same thing, but they're working out and they're doing their biceps and they're doing their triceps, but their body looks exactly the same. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to understand that, getting and working with an individual, I don't actually believe in just going and training by yourself unless you're highly skilled. I think that there's always some benefit to working with a personal trainer to get you started. So 3 to 4 days a week can be full body exercises. The general recommendation is, in terms of reps, can be between 5 and 30 reps. So it's a huge variation in terms of reps. It's about quality of work. It's about volume of work. But again, a baseline recommendation could be 10 sets per muscle per week.
Okay.
So that if you were doing, again, and it's also choosing exercises that can cross over. So if you're going to do squats, you're going to be working your glutes. And, if you're like me, maybe you're working your quads more. But picking full body compound exercises are great. Squats, deadlifts, of course, if you can do this safely. And then other things to do are functional movements like carries, kettlebell carries, or even dumbbell carries, things that may translate over to an aging individual, which unfortunately or fortunately, we're all aging.
Okay.
And so the name of the game is, how do you bulletproof your body in a way that is translatable? Like Zumba is not going to be translatable to you being able to catch yourself if you fall.
Right.
Or for you to be able to really maintain skeletal muscle as you age. And I was talking to my good friend, Alan Argon, who would be a great guest for you guys to have. And
thank you.
One of the things I think about is, as we age, there's a process of sarcopenia that happens. And I hate to say as we age, because if an individual is inactive, this could start in your 30s, meaning muscle strength decreases, muscle size decreases, the skeletal muscle changes, the fiber types. Skeletal muscle is made up of fibers. These fibers change and become less robust and become weaker. So then the question is, do you train for strength, or do you train for hypertrophy, which is muscle growth? And I would argue that you probably should train for both, But if you were going to do one that's easier, you're going to train for hypertrophy. And that, again, is 3 to 4 days a week. Again, these are broad generalizations, 10 sets per muscle group, and then you can slowly progress that. Now, so that's hypertrophy. What about high intensity interval training? I think that's essential. And you could do that. High intensity interval training is different than sprint interval training, which is maximum output. High intensity interval training is different for all, for everybody. But that would be, say, 80% or maybe a little bit higher of your VO2 max, your max effort. And again, do we test our max effort? Probably not if you're not an elite athlete, right? I don't know what my VO2 max is. But one good way to think about it is really not going to that upper threshold, but maybe slightly below that, doing some kind of heavy metabolic training once a week or once every other week would be what I recommend. So you've got hypertrophy. You're going to throw in there one high intensity interval training. This could be 4 minutes.
Okay.
This is really intense, focused effort. It's not long, drawn out cardio. We know high intensity interval activity improves lipid profiles, which is amazing, irrespective of diet. So that's important. And then I still do believe cardiovascular training is important, which is what you typically see everybody do. Or if I'm taking my babies on a run in the stroller and I'm just kind of chatting on the phone, which I can't really do well, but that kind of a thing.
Right. So I love this concept of the cardiovascular training. That's a non-negotiable. That's totally. Like you have to do that. What was the quantity of the time you said? I think I did the math in my head. It's 20 minutes.
Yeah. So it's 100. The current recommendation guidelines are 150 minutes a week. Okay. But again, this is what you should be doing. It's not, the fact that we have to make a recommendation about that is unusual for the fact that we are now grossly sedentary as humans.
Right. So my minimum is 30 of cardio. And then I'll switch off and do some strength training. But what you're saying is, which is different, is you should do it in addition.
Yeah. If I was going to do one or the other, I would do strength training.
Yeah. Okay.
It is so, the other thing that happens is if you get injured or if you get an illness where you have to be in bed, your strength and your muscle decreases. It's called a catabolic crisis, right? You lose it. And as we get older, we've all experienced it. As we get older, it becomes much more difficult to reset those gains if you're not previously well-trained. A well-trained individual, again, that's kind of nebulous, but an individual who is always trained and has reached a certain level of fitness, they're going to be set up to be able to make a comeback. There's this concept of muscle memory, which typically people think about a neuro connection, like you remember how to play tennis, but it really is also a priming of your skeletal muscle tissue to perhaps get to the previous strength quicker. So anyway, yeah, what you're saying is if I were to pick one, I would do resistance training. Cardiovascular, you'll be able to get that back. Strength, and then you have to understand skeletal muscle is this amino acid reservoir. So there's a couple things that make skeletal muscle so important. Connie, the big thing is shifting from skeletal muscle as this looking good in a bikini and this fitness kind of architecture to really muscle as medicine. And if we can focus on muscle as medicine, and we understand that what we have control over from this tissue has a much bigger impact than nearly everything that we do, including diet, muscle and training have a bigger impact than nutrition, which I hate to think about that, right? I spent 17 years studying that. So one of the things that we have to understand is that muscle is not just about fitness. And if we can bridge the gap between fitness and training, which I think that the fitness professionals really have it right, and then bridge the gap between that and muscle, now we have a winning combination. And now we can start to correct these metabolic diseases that we see.
So okay, there's so many questions and we don't have a ton of time. So let me prioritize. So before I ask this next question, let's get to kind of the plus factor, which is the nutrition.
Yeah.
So take us through how you think of, because I know I did the math when I was studying for this I saw on your website you have this great handbook, and it talks about how much protein you should eat. And which, when I did the math, the formula, I was like, oh my gosh, that's a lot. That's a lot of protein. So help everybody with like some just simple, easy tips
Great.
on nutrition and
Yeah.
and how that works with the muscle
Got it.
aspect. Yeah.
Well, right now, the current recommendation is 0.8 grams per kilogram, which that's what the RDA has set it, which is the recommended dietary allowance, which is a terrible name. That is what the research is showing to be grossly inadequate to protect individuals and really even for optimization. So from an optimization and optimal aging, optimal metabolic benefits, we know it's more likely double that.
Oh,
So
wow.
that would be, again, these recommendations haven't changed in the last 30 years. So we're looking at 1.6 grams per kilogram or higher. What does that mean? That means, from my perspective, at the very high end, you're looking at 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. So I'm 115 pounds. I'd like to stay there. 115 grams of protein would be perfectly adequate for me. Could I go lower? Totally. But I still need to eat calories. So anyone who's listening, who's more mature in age, try to hit that target. And it might seem like a lot for an individual. So if your ideal body weight is 200 pounds, you might be like, wow, I don't think I can hit 200 grams of protein. I would say, okay, well then try to hit 150 grams of protein, right? Now, the next thing that we think about, the most important thing is the 24-hour protein ingestion. So how much protein are you getting in one day?
Okay.
That's the critical question. And then the next thing, as we age, we have to understand that it really is about a meal distribution. And meal distribution simply means your first meal, your second meal, your third meal, and making sure that protein reaches a certain threshold within that meal. So for someone who's more mature, when I say more mature, you know what I'm talking about. And that is between 30, as a minimum, 30 grams of protein, which would equate to a little over 4 ounces of a high quality protein, which could be chicken or bison or whatever that is. But 30 to 50 grams of protein per meal. So an easy take home point for the listener is 1 gram per pound ideal body weight, making sure that your meal threshold is between 30 and 50 grams. And then, of course, the next thing you think about carbs and carbohydrates, to me, would be, depending on where a person is, to not exceed a 1-to-1 ratio of protein to carbohydrates. So you look like you do cardio and you probably have a pretty fast metabolism. So you personally, Connie, could probably tolerate a higher carb threshold and not have an issue,
Yeah.
Everyone will know, the one thing that doesn't change is your dietary protein. And then how you leverage it is some people can have more fat. I do well with carbohydrates. I can have more carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm. But 1-to-1 ratio is a good benchmark.
Good
And just
start.
thinking of how much do I weigh, and that's a minimum for the amount of protein. And then you take that number and then you essentially divide it by 3, right?
Yeah.
With the meals. So
yeah, or you could have 2 meals and 1 snack. The first and the last meal are the most important to get right. But again, if you're taking these tips, we don't have to overthink it. It's not hard, right? There's so much confusion in the space. Like, should you be keto? Should you be carnivore? Should you be vegan? Should you be plant-based? Like all this stuff. Okay. So great. And my second answer to that would be get your core fundamentals correct. And the core fundamentals would be, if you want to age well, you have to have strong muscle. You cannot build strong muscle on a purely diet full of carbohydrates and fat. I mean, can you do it? Yeah, most people are probably not going to be very effective at that. So what's the next step? The next step is understanding how much protein you need. And that's 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. This is a gross recommendation. Can you be higher or lower? Yes, totally. And then the next thing after that is understanding, do you want to add more carbohydrates or do you want to add more fat? But your protein really shouldn't change.
Okay. That's really, really helpful. And I'm sure everybody is, taking notes and
yeah, we want to simplify it.
Yes.
Again, and of course, there's always the conversation, is an animal or plant, and like all that stuff is very divisive. The reality is plant protein is different than animal protein. It's not like an emotional conversation. Can you get all your protein from plants? Yeah, if you want to. But for me, I prefer to eat whole foods and less processed foods.
Mhm.
So again,
Right. It's
whatever
personal
someone's
preference.
preference is, totally up to you, but you do have to prioritize protein, and the easiest way to do it is, to educate yourself in terms of what are high quality proteins and what does that look like for the individual. I think logically we understand that animal and plant proteins are different. They're made of different structures. Again, can you reach those needs through plants? Yes, but you also have to think about all the other nutrients like zinc, selenium, iron, creatine. There's all kinds of things. But again, there's always seasons for everybody, right? So if an individual wants to go through a plant-based season, go ahead. And if an individual wants to go through an animal-based season, go ahead. There's many different ways to do it. But again, all that's great. You still have to protect muscle. So it's about finding strategies that work for you to be able to protect muscle. And I'll give you another tip.
Yep.
And this is a great take-home tip for the listener, is that if you are aging, if you are concerned about sarcopenia, perhaps you're a little bit older, or you've seen, or you have some kind of chronic health condition, or you've seen your parents kind of waste away, eating protein after you train may have some benefit. In a younger individual, not so much. In a younger, healthy individual, but in an older individual, we know that there's increased blood flow. The muscles are primed for nutrient absorption. This would be a great time to have dietary protein
It's a
because your
great,
threshold is a little bit lower. You're primed for it.
right. No, that's a great tip. And it brings me back to, I remember when I was training before I got married. And I remember that my trainer said that very thing. She's like, okay, now go home and either do a protein shake or eat some tuna out of a can. Like, it's just, so, and I felt, it's so interesting, right? Like when you do these things, you feel so much better. You have so much more energy. You look better, and then so you feel better about the way you look. So it's just like, is this entire cycle.
Mhm.
So I love that you're focused on doing this. Okay, so we're running out of time, but I want to talk about muscle recovery a little bit and get your thoughts on, since muscle
Since
recovery.
on the Sunlighten, well, we use it for muscle recovery. I don't know.
Well,
I
there
don't know
can
if
be
you know
other
that.
things too, but I want, because
Yeah,
because I what I'm thinking is a lot of people that are listening are gonna make a change, right? And
we hope
so,
so.
yeah, I mean, and so they're gonna start doing muscle training and strength, and don't they need to do something for post training as far as recovery of muscle, or do they not? And what would you recommend?
I think it's a really good question. I think that we have to prioritize. I think number one is training hard enough. So
Okay.
understanding that you shouldn't be on your phone, you shouldn't be distracted, use this as an opportunity. Right now we're very primed for distraction,
Mhm.
and everyone's productivity is down, which by the way makes it really easy to succeed for those that are really focused. The
Mhm.
same goes into the gym. If you see an exceptional physique, that person is, dialed in mentally. Number one, you have to train hard enough. In terms of recovery, I would say nutrition and sleep are the biggest ones.
Mhm.
And then, of course, if you wanted to add in an extra layer, now you're talking about external sources. For example, heat. So sauna is great for muscle recovery, because it's actually really good for, there's some data to support that it protects against atrophy,
Mhm.
which is muscle wasting, and that's
Mhm.
really important. And
Mhm.
so those kinds of things. And of course, some people do uh, uh, kind of alternate between hot and cold,
Mhm.
but training hard enough, getting sleep, doing the fundamentals, which making sure that you're fueling appropriately is key.
So what is your like sauna routine, your sunlight, and like where do you fit it into your?
Yeah, typically in the evenings when the kids
Okay.
go to sleep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. And then do you do it like 30, 40 minutes, or do you do a
Mhm.
program? Yeah.
Yep. So I do it, it depends. So yesterday I did it for 20 minutes.
Mhm.
For whatever reason, I was really hot. So yeah,
Mhm.
yesterday was 20 minutes, but anywhere between, I try to push it a little bit longer. I try to push it, upwards of 40 minutes. Ideally, I'd love to do it 3 times a week, but I probably get in there once a week. Again, I have two very little children and I'm working on a book deadline right now that's due October 1st. So, you know, my computer overheats.
Yeah, yeah.
Listen.
And we always say it's better to, do something for a little bit, than
Mhm.
nothing, than not even start it just because you don't feel like you have the time. So, and we do know from studies that Sunlighten's product does help with muscle recovery and inflammation, and flexibility as well. The study was a study done in Auburn University on how using it helped with muscle flexibility, and agility. So, which is obviously, important as we age as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're running out of time. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that listeners know about muscle centric medicine, or about a simple tip with nutrition? Anything?
Yeah, well, I think that we've covered the big things. So that's understanding what your nutritional need is as far as dietary protein, understanding how you're going to dose it throughout the day, understanding if you're aging, more mature, have any kind of health kind of issue, and you really want to protect skeletal muscle, then eating post-training is very valuable. Prioritizing resistance, prioritizing a high intensity interval day, and then, of course, maintaining the cardiovascular aspect. And I will say, I do have a new podcast. Did you know that?
No, tell me.
I have a new podcast called the Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show,
Uh-huh.
and I talk about these things in great detail. So if anyone wants to listen, again, it's a labor of love, as you know how this is, and it really tries to educate people on these things. And of course, I have a lot of free material that I send out every week. If they want to sign up for my newsletter, if you guys want to sign up for my newsletter, I have a great newsletter. It's no cost, and I vet studies and things that I'm thinking about and writing about, and there's that.
Great. Well, I can speak from, personal experience. When I was on your website and I was reading the handbook and, watching the YouTube interviews that you've been
Yeah.
on. You have just so much very fascinating information, things that we should all be applying in our daily lives. And so I encourage everybody, to find the Dr. Lyon Show. I did know about it, and you're all over the place, right? It's on Spotify and on Apple.
Mhm.
So, I think that would be a great way to take the next step after, watching this and listening to this is, listening to a podcast for sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
then if people obviously want to be a patient, they can always apply.
perfect.
That's a more rigorous process, but if someone is interested, can always apply to be a patient.
That would be, I'm sure it would be extremely valuable.
Mhm.
So the other thing I wanted to make sure to share to listeners is that we are offering a significant discount on Sunlighten's products, as a result of anybody who is listening to this, or listening to her podcast and comes in and visits Sunlighten from Dr. Lyon, to
Cool.
make sure and mention that. And then you will receive up to $600, which is significant discount. So make sure you listen and share that you heard from Dr. Lyon, and we'll take it from there and make sure that you get the discount that you so deserve. So this has been so knowledgeable. My head is just spinning on all of the, for me, it's all about scheduling it in, right? And like just forcing that routine and switching it up. And so I've already have some different creative things that I'm going to change in my schedule as a result of this. And I can't wait. And I can't wait to add more protein too. Like I eat a lot of protein, but I'm not as mindful and intentional about the split, especially the first and the last, and actually thinking through the quantity, thinking, okay, was that 30 to 50,
Yeah.
grams?
That would actually change your body composition and also protect you as you age. You don't have to, again, it doesn't have to be super complicated. It's the first and the last.
Yeah.
First and the last meal are most important.
Oh, it's just fascinating. I have so many more questions we'll have to say for another show. But right now we're finishing our Sunlighten Spotlight with Dr. Lyon. We really appreciate everybody listening, and we wish you all the best. And however we can support you, we are all in. So thank you,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon.
Bye.